So if you don't know, if you're new here, we have watched this video now. This is the 5th time. Okay, we've been kind of sectioning this video. 10 secrets to achieve financial success. There's been some really good advice here. And I'm gonna watch this video, not fully, we're just gonna watch the next part. And then when we're done with that, we're gonna move to trading topics. So we're at 106. What is the next timestamp? 107.
So Anton, you've made a career based on risk, essentially, managing risk. How would you say young people should calculate which risks to take?
Okay, well, I think with risk, what it comes down to is people tend to look at risk incorrectly. So they look at risk in the two-dimensional traditional sense, which is to look at risk where...
Sorry, we'll have to go back. I was checking the audio.
Okay.
All right. Number 5. Know that risk is subjective and not two-dimensional.
Well, I think with risk, what it comes down to is people tend to look at risk incorrectly. So they look at risk in the two-dimensional traditional sense, which is...
Oh man, morning coffee.
To look at risk...
Nothing better than that.
Where you say, okay, the more risk I take, the more potential reward or loss I can have.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's looking at it two-dimensionally. The more risk I take, the more volatility I have, essentially. Mm-hmm. When in reality, in the real world, risk is actually subjective to your own personal situation.
That's true.
So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take, for example, a jobs scenario. Mm-hmm. So let's say, for example, you've got a job where you're earning $50,000 a year. And you believe that having that job is safe. There's no risk. But let's move on one step forward from that. Let's say, for example, you want to quit your job. So if you want to quit your job with no risk, you line up another job beforehand.
True.
And you agree a higher salary with another employer. And you move on to that other job by quitting your current job.
Yes.
So you line it up before.
Yes.
But let's say we scrap that and just say, okay, well, what if I just quit my job? Mm-hmm. What's the likelihood of me ever earning more than $50,000 a year in the future? Well, when you look at this and you calculate downside versus upside, it's pretty obvious. I mean, let's calculate the downside first.
Yeah.
So what can you possibly earn that's less than 50,000? Well, you can earn 40,000 a year, 30,000 a year, 20,000 a year. Zero.
Yeah.
Your downside is 50,000.
Yeah.
But the real downside, in reality, is very small. It's very likely that you're going to earn somewhere around 50 or just less than that.
True.
So that's calculating the downside. But what about the upside? Well, your upside is actually all the money in the world. It's infinite. So even if you have a very, very small percentage chance of earning infinity,
yes,
or
still
all
possible.
the money in the world, you're still earning more than 50,000.
Yes.
So your downside is very small and your upside is huge.
Yeah.
Now, the person who takes or has the $50,000 job to begin with tends to anchor themselves to that number. And then the next step is always to then, if you're anchoring yourself to that number, to take on liabilities that this number can pay for. And that to me is more risky.
Yeah.
And that's why risk is subjective and not fully two-dimensional in the real world, because it's subjective to your own personal situation.
True.
So in that scenario, you feel like you're not taking risk, but you are.
Yeah.
Because you're taking on lots of liabilities, and therefore you actually can't assess risk objectively.
Yes.
And this is the problem with risk in the real world, is that most people can't look at it objectively.
Yes.
So when we looked at that jobs example, we very objectively calculated downside versus upside. But if you have all...
You know, this is one of those topics that risk, it's one of those topics, and it relates to everything really, but you know, trading, economics, finance, whatever. It's really those topics that's really misunderstood, I feel like. I don't think most people will actually understand what risk is. Even traders, most traders, they will only look at it as losing X amount of dollars. Nothing else. But this is very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. I wonder if we could find like an actual lecture. If we go on YouTube and let's do like economics risk lecture. Let's try to find something. So that's an hour. That's an hour. That's an hour. That's an hour. That's about bonds, which is funny. That's over an hour. Yeah, we can find a lot of stuff here. Oh, look at this. William Ackman. Everything you need to know about finance and investing in under an hour. Isn't this JP Morgan Chase's CEO? Yeah, there's a lot of lectures here about risk. I should probably watch some of these on my own time. Obviously, these are very old now, but you know, this is one of those topics that it doesn't really change. So it doesn't matter how old the lecture really is.
All these liabilities, you can't look at it with clarity. So going back to this point that we've talked about before, with freedom, and freedom being the number one asset that you can possibly have.
Yes.
Freedom allows you to be objective.
Yes.
When you're assessing risk, because you will look at everything with clarity and look at everything with very simple downside versus upside.
That's very true, actually.
And
if you already have a bunch of liabilities, you know, you have your rent, maybe you have some loans, like, well, actually rent is not too bad, but you know, let's say you live month to month, right? You're not gonna have the mental clarity to assess your situation objectively. Not really, unless you're like super intelligent or something like that. I don't know.
Ideal situation to work towards is not having personal liabilities and assessing risk in terms of business by essentially trying to work towards business risk where you've got very limited downside but huge upside, and getting yourself into that situation and repeating it an infinite amount of times so you can become wealthy. So, you know, for young people, in terms of what risks they should be taking or looking to take, the first thing to do is step outside yourself and assess your current situation. Mm-hmm. And if you have lots of liabilities, you need to work towards freedom.
Yes, that's
and
the first step.
You're working towards a situation in which you can assess risk objectively.
Yes.
So step outside yourself and look at yourself objectively.
Yes.
And work towards that situation.
You know, what really annoys me is that these are not common topics in a sense that these are not taught in school. Not really, unless you go to business school, like economics or something like that. But this topic is so important for the average person. It kind of makes me feel annoyed, or let's say bad, that the average person is not taught these things, right? Like when I was in school, let's say like not middle school, but let's say like high school, they didn't teach us how taxes work, or what's inflation, or debt. They didn't talk about those things. They talked about nonsense, right? A bunch of nonsense. I remember we used to have like sociology classes. I'm in Europe, so I think we have a better education here than many parts of the world, but the point still stands. They don't actually teach you how the financial system works unless you go to a university and you do some own research. But even if you go to a business university or economics university or something like that, they only teach you their model. They don't actually support you to be a free thinker unless you find a really good professor. But they're only going to teach you their model of thinking. And that's also a downside. And so if you go to a business school, or if you're in a business school right now, you want to be very aware of that fact that the school is teaching you their model of thinking. And it might not be the best model, and it might be leaving some very important stuff out. Right? So if you're in a business school in economics, or even if you're just learning about that topic yourself, you want to always be very critical of what you take as a law. And you don't actually even have to do that. I'll give you a really good example. Every business school you go to will tell you that you need inflation for GDP growth. And it is technically true. However, why does the GDP need to keep growing? They can't seem to answer that question. And you can say, oh, the population is growing and all that. The economy needs to grow for the population to grow. Sure. Right? But does that translate to GDP? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Okay? So that's one example of how financial education is kind of flawed.
And it's difficult to do, but it's something that just has to be done. Otherwise, you're going to always remain in a situation where you cannot assess risk objectively. So step outside yourself and get the clarity. Work towards it. And then try to position yourself in scenarios all the time where you have very limited downside and business risk, but huge upside. And for me, that's the key. So if you understand that risk is subjective, you can then take the next step to working towards being objective, and then getting yourself in that scenario, calculating
Very
downside
good.
versus upside correctly, and repeating it an infinite amount of times. If you do that well, you'll become wealthy.
Let's actually hear that again. Let's hear that again.
Promise.
That was so important. Let's hear that
So
again.
if you understand that
Let's do this one more
downside
time.
and business risk, but huge upside. And for me, that's the key. So if you understand that risk is subjective, you can then take the next step to working towards being objective, and then getting yourself in that scenario, calculating downside versus upside correctly, and repeating it an infinite amount of times. If you do that well, you'll become wealthy.
That was great. That was actually great. That was a good watch. That was a really good watch.